Scaling the Summit is a podcast developed by UN Global Pulse and the United Nations Innovation Network. The podcast explores essential elements to scale innovations in development and humanitarian contexts. It draws on relevant innovation research and shares experiences from a wide range of practitioners. Ultimately, we hope to give insight into what it takes to move from an idea to a fully scaled solution within the UN system. Now, we heard in an earlier podcast about some of the challenges associated with managing the journey to scale as a multiplayer game. We need to think about building value networks, and particularly about how do we find partners, how do we form relationships with them, and how do we get them to perform. So what we want to focus on in this podcast particularly is that question of how we work with value networks to get them to perform. And once again, to help us with this, we have Ian Gray of Gray.Catalyst. Ian, perhaps you could frame again for us the question, how do we work with value networks?
Value networks, as you scale, often get far more complicated than when you're at a pilot, because you're having to engage with more and more entities often. And so there's two things you really need to know about these kind of roles, or the entities playing these roles, and then maybe talk a little bit about how you go about managing them. And so the first is, because we talk about roles are distinct from the entities themselves. That's why we call them roles. So it might be that you've got the Ministry of Health. Mm-hmm. Now, the Ministry of Health is a stakeholder, or an entity, or a node in a network, whatever language you want to talk. But they can play multiple roles at once. So if you think about the Ministry of Health for a health innovation, they might play the cartographer role. So they might be involved in saying whether your innovation can have a license if it needs one. They might be on the panel giving licenses. But they're not only playing that role, they might be playing a value consumer role. Because if your innovation is about improving the performance, say, of a community health worker, by giving them some kind of AI, kind of doctor in their pocket app, then they're also playing the value consumer role, because they'll be buying that and using it. And so what you've got there are just two roles that one stakeholder, the Ministry of Health, might be playing. And this is a key thing to think, and why normal stakeholder ways of thinking and node ways of thinking don't really hit the mark. Because really what you need to ascertain is, what is the primary role of the Ministry of Health here? What do we need to provide them? And then what are the secondary roles of that Ministry of Health? And they could be playing 2 or 3 other roles. And what do we need to provide them from that? And so having a far more nuanced understanding of a Ministry of Health, and about actually what value are they seeking to capture as a Ministry of Health, so playing that value capture role, what value are they seeking as a value consumer, what value do they need to create as a cartographer. Thinking through all of that and saying, how do we help them with that, is really going to help with the adoption of your innovation. So that's the first thing. Entities play multiple roles, and you need to think about all those roles. The second is that those roles can change over time. And so I'll give another example. Work with a ed tech innovation. And they had a part of their value network, a member of their value network, that was a co-creator. And that was a consultancy that developed curriculum. So they basically worked with them to develop that curriculum, and that was great. Great partnership, worked really well as they were developing the innovation. But then as they were going to scale, they realized each new country, if they wanted to be curriculum aligned with that country, they had to write a new curriculum. And so if you think about it, once they were scaling to 1, 2, 3, 4 countries, this needed to become a core capability for them. So instead of having that consultancy as a co-creator, they brought that skill in-house. And then when I was talking with them, we were at the stage of saying, well, actually, you've got so good at that curriculum development. Is that a service offering that you could offer yourselves? And so there was a potential then of them becoming a competitor. So the old co-creator would become a competitor in that market, that kind of old consultancy doing curriculum development. Suddenly, they're your competitor if you're offering that service. The same innovation, to give another example, is they work with software development team to kind of create the app. And that software development team, what you find often, and less for a UN audience, but certainly for startups, you find that those you can partner with in value creation in the early stages, if you're a startup, aren't likely to be big players. And so the issue that they had is they partnered with another small niche kind of software development company. And then as they wanted to scale, that software development company couldn't scale at the same speed. They just weren't able to scale at the same speed. And so they had to change their software development partner. So that role about also what they brought in-house around that software development and what they kept out-house, again, changed. And so what you find is that the roles changed a lot sometimes between pilot and scaling. Yeah. And just finally within that, what you sometimes find with that in that is you keep the same partner. So not like the last two examples, you might keep the same partner, but the main value creation is done. Yes, you'll carry on with continuous improvement and trying to tweak and do incremental innovation around it, but the main value creation is done. And what you often find then is you're in a phase of not this kind of co-creative, really transformational relationship to a transactional, actually, we need this in our service level agreement with you now. You need to be able to produce this amount, or you need to provide this level of service for this amount of hours in these geographies, etc. And it gets quite transactional. Yeah. And so managing that relationship from a quite cozy, cuddly, transformative co-creation experience to a, hey, we're scaling now, we've got to hit our numbers, we've got to deliver at scale consistently with consistent quality, and these are what we require of you, feels quite transactional. And there's often a lot of bumps and scrapes on that journey. So they're the two things you really need to think about. That stakeholders, entities can play different roles at once. And as you go on the scaling journey, those roles can change over time. So you talked about managing the value network. That's managing those individual relationships with those value network entities that you might have a relationship with that you've got to manage. And they're two things to think about as you go through that. But the third is you're not just thinking about individual entities. You're thinking about how does this network perform as a whole? How does it work as a whole? And what we talk about is there's some of these entities and stakeholders that you'll need to partner with. You'll have to have some kind of relationship with them, whether it's a contract, a memorandum of understanding, a partnership agreement, or just shaking hands. You've got that kind of organisation to organisational person relationship. But there are others, like we talked about complementers before, maybe cartographers, that you're not in a partnership agreement with them, but you still need them to exist in your value network for your innovation to scale and provide value. And so what we talk about is those organizations that you have some kind of relationship being within your inner value network. So you have a relationship with them that needs to be managed. So if you've got to manage that relationship, it's in your inner value network. And those outside of that, where you might want to influence, but you don't actually have a relationship, they're in your outer value network. And what we find is over time that your inner value network is likely to grow as more entities you need to engage with in some kind of relationship, whether it's a formal contract or an informal agreement. But that happens over time. But it's about understanding which of these entities need to be in our inner value network and which are in our outer value network. And you need to be talking about managing your inner value network and monitoring your outer value network so you know what's going on with them. for instance, competitors, cartographers, etc. And then within your inner value network, there are different structures you can have, different type of partnership structures. There's not just one size fits all. So thinking through what makes sense for us in managing this, and what made sense in the early stages of your innovation might not be the best way to think about managing those inner value network when you get into scale. And I talked about the fact that your inner value network might expand to get outer value network kind of entities in. Obvious example of that is, for instance, with the cartographer role, for instance. So what you have found, and what I've found working with one innovation team in education as well, is they basically worked alongside the Ministry of Education to co-design the innovation. So instead of being the cartographer, they became a co-creator as well. So they worked on that. It took a lot of lobbying, a lot of influencing, a lot of kind of involvement, but they got there. But there's lots of organizations, private business do it all the time, where you might say, actually, our way to that is through maybe a umbrella organization, whether it's a kind of a group of UN agencies in country, or whether it's a NGO umbrella body, or whatever it might be, or industry bodies sometimes. They're saying, okay, how do we get in there and make those connections, but also with complementers. So you might find actually in the context we're in now, there's a complementer, it works really well, but there's no equivalent in the next country where we go to. So essentially we've got to create that complementer, and that's going to mean actively engaging with a partner, whether that's persuading the complementer we use now and getting into partnership with them in that new country, or whether it's identifying someone else. You might need to partner with some entity that was currently thought of as being in your outer value network and bring them into your inner value network.
Well, thanks, Ian. That's really helpful framing of the challenge. We really need to think hard about this question of how do we work with networks. Well, we're delighted to have with us today Tanya Akoni. And Tanya, thank you so much. Tanya is a senior advisor on innovation for UNICEF, and I know has a great deal of experience around this question of scaling. So Tanya, perhaps can I throw the ball firmly in your court? Can you tell us a bit about the challenge of finding, forming and getting partnerships to perform?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me into this discussion. So I think we're very fortunate at UNICEF to have had, be among the entities in the UN who've been at this the longest, and definitely with scaling at the heart. So if we step back, we absolutely would agree that there is nothing that you can put in place at scale to address for us change, to influence solutions that can address the child-related SDGs, which are huge, big global goals. So we need to be ambitious. And that means we need to sort of really take the global community that's relevant for each challenge together with us. And partnerships, I want to emphasize when I say this, I'm not only talking about the very valued donors and funders who provide resources, financial or otherwise, but it's really a whole set of actors that go from community organizations, young people's organizations, all the way through to those who could be researchers, young people at the other end of the scale who are kind of volunteering, the private sector, intellectual philanthropy. It's really the entire, as you say, ecosystem is the right word, that can together create a very resilient network that not only helps to scale, but to sustain these sort of solutions. We really consider partnership to be absolutely essential. And I know in your model, you have a whole range of roles, and, those partnership roles can really be, we partner with the cartographers of the systems, our government partners. We partner with actually sometimes people that you might think of as competitors, because actually the end result is not like in the private sector, a zero-sum game that either you're getting the consumer or we are. It's really around how can we really share and all work to get more of, I guess, the actual consumers get for us young people, or those around them that can really use a solution to benefit them. So it's quite interesting. Our competitors are often not competitors. There are others that can actually be creators. So almost like, you have a shift. So partners and channels, for example, you mentioned that as well. There's channels to get sort of solutions through for us when we can work in those and with those kind of entities to be more partners in the ecosystem rather than mechanisms to just transfer and move something, the more effective that is, essentially. And the more if we can prove, and to your point about performing, if our solutions perform and they deliver value to all these actors in the partnership landscape, they will be more convinced the partnership and the solution will be more resilient. So let me stop talking about that in abstract. I have two very different examples to share that I thought would be, really perhaps fascinate our listeners. One is called Upshift. And Upshift is an incredible social innovation and entrepreneurship experience. So it's really consists of multiple stages of learning, but experiential learning that is targeted at young people and for them to acquire entrepreneurial and transferable skills. So some of this is delivered digitally, some of it is delivered in kind of very in-person workshop, boot camp type settings. And initially, you might think that would restrict the kind of scale that can be achieved, but in fact, that's not. And the end of last year, actually, we had 4.1 million young people in 41 countries completing 95 million learning hours of this experiential learning practice. So, very much at scale. And how do we get there? So that's one example I want to talk about. And the other is our work on innovation nodes. So that is knowledge and wisdom, generating new knowledge and wisdom in unknown areas that are emerging from research and technology, and helping to democratize and connect that with development practitioners who see real challenges and are seeking solutions. And actually, what in your model would be the cartographers, the policymakers, the decision makers in government, especially, to how they can see these emerging technologies and really sort of help to create the sort of environment where communities and their citizens can benefit. So very different examples, but both very global at scale. And the one on innovation nodes has had 34 researchers last year alone working on it in 11 institutions on almost every continent except for Antarctica. And and it's a practice that's actually been pulled up and recognized as this value creating partnership approach and ecosystem by diverse groups. So for example, we just shared this at the Science, Technology and Innovation Forum at the UN that just finished. And the interest there was really, how does this value ecosystem work and what can we learn from it in terms of building and networking the sort of science policy interface. So that's really a focus of one group. So quite specific. We go all the way to the other side, and LinkedIn invited us to speak to their top 1,000 CEOs last year, because they were really fascinated about how have you tapped into these very very different groups of researchers and all these different topics to really unlock this value for that network. So delivering the value is recognized in that sense of partnership by very different people in the world. So when we sort of talk about what's important and how do we identify, form these partnerships and then get them to sort of perform, I think that the most important question is actually the one that I know you've addressed in an earlier podcast, which is understanding your landscape, understanding who's in it, and for us the key piece is, who do you choose to partner with? And often I think people can feel under pressure to just get some partners on board so we can move something forward. And I think our experience tells us that it is very worthwhile having, some deep discussions with your partners so that you do understand, a term that's thrown around, shared value. Do you really have shared values? What happens when you come to making a difficult decision? Are your values that shared, that you will agree in terms of how to sort of move forward? And those can come up in sort of really different ways. So, for example, in Upshift, where we may start partnering with just one sort of part of the ecosystem and groups of partners that may be looking at out of school young people, very, very marginalized young people who, of course, we care about extremely deeply. And then we've had, an initiative where we've been focused on scaling for students who are no longer students. They're completely not in school. And, the government coming to us and saying, well, this is incredible. This program, forget about that group of students. We want it for all students. And that's fantastic. And when your partners, you've had that conversation, which says when or if that kind of opportunity to go from a really small sliver to all students comes up, we're both going to stand up, or it's just never both, but we're all going to stand up and say, that's marvelous. And it's going to be, and it's not going to be either or. We're not going to sort of be enticed only to go with the largest scale, but also, to be sure that we continue to benefit those who are most marginalized, because sometimes that is one of those questions when you are focused on scaling. What is it reach? Is it reach in proportion to need, where you're looking at really, marginalized groups, or is it reach in terms of really big numbers? And often your values will really inform that, and that's a key scaling question. And in all cases, we've been able to, really, and leverage that and be able to put our arms around, in these 4.1 million people, not only those who are out of school, not only those who are in school, not only those who are, very marginalized, such as, young people with disabilities, but all children everywhere, which of course is our core value. So I think that's where that kind of piece sort of comes in, and it becomes really, really important to have that kind of values alignment. We have a number of tools that we've actually developed, because of course, when you go through this with 47 different countries, you realize that there are a set of key stakeholders that you can identify to be your partners. And those are certainly always government. But for us, we've learned there's both those who are dealing with the formal and the non-formal. So it's not only the Ministry of Education who might be primarily focused, on those who are in school, but those who are out of school. It's those working on youth. It's a whole range of NGOs, especially these really strong local entities who really, have tremendous experience and a lot of faith and trust from the communities they work in. It's teachers, it's mentors, and you also look at kind of the entrepreneurship ecosystem. And of course, yes, philanthropic organizations, those who can bring all sorts of resources to bear, but which really around that full set and around aligning them. So we have a toolkit. We've kind of developed a version of what everyone recognizes as a business model canvas, but it's really an Upshift impact at scale model canvas, where we're bringing all of these sort of together, and you are being able to see, where are your partners coming in? What is the value that we're all creating together, which is much greater than individually, any of those actors alone could be. And really, how are we going to measure this, and what are the incentives and the continued incentives for all, entities in that? And of course, at the center, it's always about the benefit for young children. And then the entire toolkit and that's one that's sort of very much focused on the partnerships, but it pulls out all sorts of different tools. And that toolkit has kind of been through being tested and iterated, and in each country that we roll this out to. So I think we're very fortunate, and I think being able to capture that knowledge so that others can adapt and adopt it is absolutely critical. It's obviously efficient as well, but it is also something that you put this back into understanding your value network. You are, from the process, putting value back into the network. Here is what we learned from working together. Here's what we've learned about conditions for our success. Working, what have we managed to refine in terms of engaging with trusted local organizations, or what are the sorts of things to measure that really matter, and different things matter to different partners. I think that becomes sort of super important, and then becomes a real engine in and of itself to not only scale, but to sustain that scale. If I turn to the innovation nodes example, that's quite different, because you're looking at, again, the values piece is absolutely critical, because there you're looking fundamentally at, do you value the impact that your research has? Are you interested in intellectual philanthropy? Where do these things coincide with intellectual property? And how open are you willing to be with your intellectual, property? What sort of a pathway is this piece of research taking in its development, as it will, move towards some form of commercialization? Are you open to something being, sort of really open access, and to what extent, and what sort of business models lie at that core? So again, a lot of time actually talking in the beginning. And in another world, you would call this contracting. It's really around understanding the terms of engagement. And from that, similarly, we have developed our first iteration, because this is something that's relatively new, but our first iteration of a toolkit in which we've actually learned from our partners. In fact, parts of that toolkit were developed and shared with us by some of our sort of academic partners around, things that they have found useful, things that they have put in place to manage partners that they partner with, and that we've managed to then use and work with them to adopt, adapt, and test with others. So it really is this, incredible engine of knowledge creation of not only how we can do this, but then there's also the what. And so to just demystify that, the what are we looking at in these partnerships is, when I said sort of emerging research that we know little about, it's things like biotechnology, or the next generations of renewable energy, gene therapies, other types of precision health, the future of water and sanitation. So really not the innovations we have in hand that we are scaling today, but understanding so we can plan to bring on board and understand the implications of the solutions that will come tomorrow.
Wow. That's tremendous. Two great examples, and there's a kind of spectrum of learning going on here. And what I particularly like is there's a sense that there is a process. This isn't just an ad hoc throwing partners together. There's a process, and you're developing, and sounds fascinating, a toolkit which can be adapted and deployed to help that process. I guess one question I have, relationships change over time. It's not a case, we're talking about scaling being a long-term thing. This doesn't happen overnight. And so the nature of the relationships might change. It might begin in a fairly formal, sort of fairly arm's length relationship, but maybe you're able to draw people on board, maybe they become interested, maybe they see some benefits themselves. I wonder if you could comment on the dynamics, how these changing relationships happen, and in particular, how you could draw them more closely to what we would call your inner value network.
And I think one thing is to recognize exactly what you've said, is that it's quite organic, and it is almost a life cycle, and the life cycle has many on ramps and off ramps. So it is not necessary that the supercharging dedicated first movers that you bring in as partners, they might be less excited as the thing becomes bigger and bigger, because what they, for them, the value of having been part of maybe an inner value network at that beginning stage becomes less exciting and less of interest, because they're more interested in things that are startup. Conversely, you may bring on partners at a later time who really want to sort of see some evidence. They're wanting to be engaged because of who they are, and that's understanding who they are. So it is sort of like an understanding through your seasons of growth, through your life cycle, when and how and what the incentive and value is that you're creating for your partners. But I think for those who are the closest, and who move from that outer to the inner value network, and who are really sort of sustaining, I think some of the key sort of critical factors that we've seen is really being quite open and highly engaged with those partners. So, it's not a transactional relationship where, we can see we would like X and you have X and maybe we have Y, and, we just transact that. And as long as you get that particular thing and we get this, everyone is actually happy. It's around kind of looking almost for the added value. And I think it's when you start delivering added value and there's more than what you expected to get out from this whole partnership. And you can sort of see how this is of interest moving forward in a longer term, where that means beyond a year, beyond 2 years, etc. And you become sort of, you are seen as driving that. And I think partners have also valued, for example, in our node network, we started off with 1-year agreements. And actually it was our partners some of them who said, well, but this is fascinating. I know we got involved to do this piece of work, but we actually want to now meet and connect with more of these other partners that you're bringing on board. And while we may not have immediate value in a particular sort of scientific area of research to offer for the thing that you're then focusing on, we think that we can have value, through really amplifying what you're doing. And maybe we know somebody else who we can bring on board. But we want to be part of this kind of community going forward. And so that has led us to do something which is also sort of operationally efficient, but it's these multi-year agreements. And it allows us to be very flexible in terms of, in this period of time, you're coming in to really be contributing a lot of, intellectual and research material. But at another point, you might be, in your words, a channel, right? You might be, so you move from being a co-creator to being a channel person, or, someone else, sort of a conveyor who's actually promoting things. And it's, I think, allowing, if you can, for your partners to evolve themselves in their roles and in the value that they can both contribute and receive through their partnership in this network. That becomes, I think that's your sort of, ideal. And especially if you have your partners asking for it, that's sort of almost your best endorsement, as opposed to sort of trying to sell them on the idea, like, wouldn't you like to kind of keep working with us because the last thing went really well? Or, it's when they come to you and say, but we want to keep engaged, and we see other things of value coming out of this, and that's really exciting. And I think that's really, that for us, that might be a really concrete indicator of this partner has moved from your outer value network to your inner value network, because they're also talking and thinking about a longer term engagement.
Lovely. That's really nice. I guess as you talk, there's a wealth of experience that you and your colleagues have accumulated, and thank you so much for sharing. Perhaps I can push you a little bit into slightly more tricky territory. We often hear the success stories, but we learn a lot from things that don't work. I wonder, without necessarily naming names, but could you comment on a few things to avoid in this process of building effective and performing partnerships?
I mean, I think absolutely. And I think I'll come back to where I started, which is two things, sort of in the rush to sign up, partners to a solution, not spending perhaps enough time on making sure your values aligned, so that when the difficult questions come up, you're not sort of actually then realizing you're not quite aligned actually. And I think that that is key. I think also being explicit. I think we cannot underestimate the opportunity for two groups of people to walk out of something thinking they're both absolutely clear and agree, and then only to discover later that isn't the case. I think that it's worthwhile spending the time upfront to sort of be explicit. Where are we going? How we're going to kind of get there? And sometimes, we've spent with some partners, we've invested time in doing workshops that, sometimes colleagues have asked, well, why are you wasting this time if they're asking all these detailed questions? Just get it over with. Can't you just like move them forward? And it ends up though that what you're building is more than a common understanding. You're building sort of trust and a relationship. And actually, for some of these, it's turned out where we've kind of gone really deep into, well, how do you guys decide on X? Do I have a role in this? What is your governance? You talk about these international public sector accounting standards. What the heck do you mean when you're talking about this? Just all these things that then actually have ended up creating resources that we've been able to share with other partners, that has helped with their understanding without going through that entire loop. I think the other piece is also sometimes, when I say sort of being specific, having no specifics at all. So it's possible just to sort of, and I can think of an example like a number of years ago, but where you had two entities who were thrilled to work together. They weren't quite sure on what, but went ahead and signed, those lovely things, those MOUs, so they're, memorandum of understanding, we're going to do stuff. And then we spent so much time struggling to work out what the stuff was. And that was really unfortunate, and whether it would have been better to spend that time up front, because I think both parties ended up being a bit frustrated. And I just recently heard a UN colleague use a fun acronym that I think this sort of was just perfect for this, where he said, MOUs, we should just run away from them because they're actually MOMs. And we all looked, oh no, another acronym, we don't know, what is that? He said, it's memorandums of misunderstanding. I thought, there you go, just because there can be, if you don't quickly tie it down next to truly what you're trying to work on together, then you can end up disappointing everyone, because no one really knew what you were trying to aim for, and everyone maybe had a different destination in mind.
Lovely. Oh, that's great. And I'm going to remember that MOM. I think that's brilliant. Tanya, thank you so much. What we've been trying to do with the podcast and with other activities in the scaling group is share what we're all learning around this community of practice, trying to engage with the scaling question. That's been really helpful. I'm sure if people have particular questions, they can trace you and perhaps get your further insights. But for now, thank you so much.